Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is ArtNet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news, expertly compiled by the ArtNet Pro editorial team.
He learned a huge amount in the 50s, and that's what makes it possible for him to do the great pop art in the 1960s. Without his 50s experiences, I don't think he ever would have done the great pop art he did.
I'm William Van Meter, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast by ArtNet News. With his themes of repetition and appropriation, Andy Warhol's work can seem mass-produced. He was prone to say that his assistant did his work for him and invent different narratives in interviews. In fact, weaving tall tales and shaping his own mythology was part of his art. He was creating the ultimate persona of an artist every bit as pop as his paintings, one who specialized in glacial cool and glib detachment. Although the paintings might seem like they came off of a conveyor belt, that was by design, and he maintained close involvement with his work. In fact, before silkscreen printing became his trademark, Warhol hand-painted the 32 canvases that make up 1962's Campbell's soup cans. Warhol gained fame in the 1960s as part of the pop boom, but this was the second phase of his career. He spent the 1950s in New York as a successful commercial illustrator, doing advertisements and book and record covers. All the while, he made personal work and had a smattering of shows in small galleries. Most of them were ignored or poorly received, but the seeds of his subversive repertoire were being slyly developed in his intimate drawings. Late in his life, Warhol will return to hand painting. For this week's episode, our guest is the journalist, critic, and author of the 2020 biography Warhol. I admit, I slept on the book when it was first released. What more could be said about the artist that the heap of other biographies hadn't covered? Plenty, actually. Gopnik spent 8 years researching and writing Warhol, and at almost 1,000 pages, it is filled with details and newly discovered data. On this episode, we discuss Warhol by hand, his pre-pop era, as well as some of his later, less mechanized moments, such as his collaboration with Jean-Michel Basquiat. Hi, Blake. Thanks so much for joining us today on The Art Angle.
Total treat. Can't wait to talk about Warhol with you.
Warhol is an artist that I think people think about as the conveyor belt artist or an artist who works by silk screens or by using emissaries to make the work. And he had such a huge body of work that he did himself by hand before he became this huge figure in American art.
Yeah, absolutely. The handmade stuff is really important, but it's worth mentioning that the whole concept, the cliche of him being a mass producer of art is just completely wrong. Even his silk screens were completely artisanal. He never had an assembly line. That was a shtick. And Warhol's life is all about one shtick after another. And some of his most important shticks get developed in the 50s in some of his handmade work, in fact.
It seems like his goal was always to be a fine artist, but before that he embarked upon that, he had a very successful career as a commercial artist in the 50s in New York after he finished art school. But during the time, he kind of had a fake it until you make it attitude that he made sure that he looked the part of a fine artist by wearing like a raggedy suit and having like paint scuffs like all over the shoes and everything, that he really wanted to look the part even if he wasn't the part.
Yeah, it's really complicated. I mean, this is the 50s. This is before the boom in the art market in the United States. So very few artists could really make much of a living at all. Late 40s, early 50s, you kind of had to make commercial art in order to keep yourself fed. And that's what they were taught at the Carnegie Institute of Technology in the art department was, you all should want to be fine artists, but you're going to have to do commercial work to feed yourselves. But also, because this is, the lefty 40s, also, the collapsing the gap between commercial and fine had a certain energy to it, I think, at that moment. So it's a really complicated psychological situation. But you're totally right. Warhol wanted to be one way or another a classic avant-gardist, which included bohemian clothes. And for a while, he lived in the most bohemian loft with some of those bohemian people in New York when he first got to New York. So asserting himself as a member of the avant-garde was really important to him. But weirdly, that's not what mattered in his commercial career. People sort of get it wrong. His commercial work of the 50s was actually relatively mainstream. Some of the art directors who hired him said, yeah, we hired Andy. He was really good. He was especially good at producing work on time and in large quantities. So it would give you a bunch of different options to choose between. But they always said, but you know what? There were a lot of other people who did pretty similar work. And I once played a really mean trick on Matt Werbekin, one of the greatest Warhol scholars ever. I showed him 3 of these handmade commercial drawings by Andy Warhol, or at least that's what I told him, and asked him to tell me about them, comment on them, and he did that smartly. But actually, I knew none of them were by Andy Warhol. They were by other people working at the same moment in a similar mode. So there was a period style, and Andy was a master of that period's commercial style. And I'm talking here about his commercial work. You know, a lot of people imagine that Andy had his first fine art shows in the 1960s with his pop art, but he had maybe 5 or 6 fine art gallery shows in the 50s that people don't really know much about because they were just wildly unsuccessful. And we can talk about exactly why in a minute. But the commercial work was not at the level of fine art. I don't think he thought it was. It was business. And that's another thing that really matters about it. I once had a conversation with one of the world's foremost Picasso experts. And they said, if Picasso had been hit by a bus in 1906 or 1907, he wouldn't mean anything to us. He'd just be a minor follower of Odilon Redon. Forget the blue period, forget the rose period. None of that would really have mattered in art history. And the truth is, that's kind of true about Warhol as well. If he'd been hit by a bus in 1959 or 1960, he'd be considered an interesting 50s illustrator, if that. Like, how many 50s illustrators can you name? It's only really the later work that makes him matter in art history. But the 50s work really matters because it gives us a window into where the 60s work comes from, in a sense. And there are elements of it in the 50s. He learned a huge amount in the 50s, and that's what makes it possible for him to do the great pop art in the 1960s. Without his 50s experiences, I don't think he ever would have done the great pop art he did. But it's complicated.
Yeah, you know, and it was good. It's like the commercial work had allowed him to survive and flourish and buy a house. And it also gave him the safety to show this smaller scale fine art in these very small galleries and have it be ignored and experiment. And you can understand why it wasn't successful. You know, here's someone who kind of made their name by drawing shoes, having a show about shoes. And I can see why that was not accepted. That wouldn't be accepted now.
That show actually was marginally successful. The work from the 50s that matters as fine art, and I think it really matters a whole lot, even though it was totally unsuccessful, is the gay work he did. That's where he really matters in the 1950s. There are a couple of his shows at a gallery called the Bodley Gallery, which was mostly showing, in fact, gay artists or art for a gay crowd. It was in kind of the gay neighborhood in the 50s on the Upper East Side in New York at the time. You know, he was doing pictures of, as people say, boys kissing, and imagery that was clearly homosocial with a strong homoerotic undertone. He may even have shown some or at least erotic images, or even semi-pornographic ones. We don't know exactly. Those probably weren't shown, but he was certainly making those images, and everyone knew it, including images of, you know, his friends' erect penises. So the gay work is completely radical. And even the much more mild homoerotic work or homosocial work he showed was way too much for the period. The critics, they were too shy to actually say, we won't tolerate this homosexual work, because that was going too far. But they would say, it reminds us of Jean Cocteau, which was code for this is gay.
I think also this was like a period of abstract expressionism, and just him being figurative in the first place was kind of weird, but that it was just so extremely gay, there was no place for it.
Yeah, I mean, anyone in the gay community knew exactly what was going on and rejoiced in this work. But that was not acceptable in the larger mainstream. There was figurative work in the 50s. Abstraction was still considered a marginal avant-garde even in the 50s. But the kind of work he was doing with an explicit gay content is hugely exciting, hugely important, hugely brave. From our current vantage point, that's really important work. But there's no way that could circulate, and he discovered that. He realized that he had to move on from that kind of work, or he just could never make it. But also the commercial work, I think importantly, is about gender, right? Here's a man making work that's almost entirely for a female audience, right? For the new post-war female bourgeoisie with buying power, right? So there is a sense, and people talked about this at the time, that his particular style, his effete style, his very fey style, was a way for him to inhabit the female world, the female culture, feminine domain. And that made the work attractive, I think. That made the work sell. That made the work important. Because the artists that he was influenced by, the commercial and fine artists like Ben Shahn, actually tended to be on the macho side of things and made politically aggressive work that definitely did not have a fey quality to it. And what Warhol does is he takes the same style, the fractured line that Ben Shahn came up with, and turns it into something much more decorative, much more feminine, which was perfect for women's shoes, women's dresses, women's magazines.
That's something to talk about is just his line, is that blotted line. In the book, that was the first time I learned that he kind of lifted that technique from somebody, that he learned that in art school from Ben Shahn.
Yeah, I mean, Ben Shahn didn't use the technique. All Warhol did was he couldn't figure out how the other artists were doing it, so he invented his own way of generating a broken line. And he did that by first drawing a normal line with lots and lots of ink and then blotting it. And once he used, as it were, the blotting paper as the finished image, the line automatically got broken. So in a way, there was an automatic quality, almost, if you'd like, a surreal quality to this line. You could sort of tell that there was a mechanism behind it, that it didn't come directly from his pen, that there was something mechanical producing that fractured line with Warhol. And that certainly made it more interesting to everyone.
Can you talk a little bit more about like what the look of this is? It's such a look, but it's hard to describe, I feel.
Yeah, in 1949, Warhol invents this particular, although it wasn't Warhol, it was Andrew Warhola at that point. He's not yet Andy Warhol. But this young man, Andrew Warhola, invents a new way of making drawings where he copies a kind of fractured, broken dot and dash line that had been invented by Ben Shahn more than anything else. Ben Shahn was the most important artist of the 1940s, a huge superstar. Warhol sees his work and decides that he's got to find out how to make that kind of line. But what he does is he makes a very heavily inked drawing and then blots it with another piece of paper. When he uses the blotter as his finished image, it's got a kind of fractured line. And that is really interesting for a few reasons. It makes it clear, at least sort of subconsciously, that there's a mechanism involved, that there's something mechanical about the production of this line. But also, really importantly, he almost always bases his images on photographs, as Ben Shahn did too, for that matter, but it's more obvious in Warhol. So there's this weird internal tension between a photographic source, which you can kind of feel in the images, in the foreshortenings and all of the things that photography can capture from the world, and yet it's this incredibly artisanal line that renders that photographic image. So it's both incredibly modern, but also kind of nostalgic and distressed and old-fashioned, even sort of 18th century in the look of his line. And he runs with that. There's definitely a kind of decadent quality to his drawings, elements of Fragonard, if you like. There's a kind of frou-frou sexuality in every single drawing he does in the 1950s.
And it's interesting that he pulls his mother into a lot of this creation by using her fanciful cursive. And as it turns out, that is from her, I don't know what her native country is, not Czechoslovakia. It's like an area in the Caucasus Mountains, I think, where she speaks Rusin.
Rusin, yeah. I mean, it was Czechoslovakia at various points during her life. It was originally the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then it becomes Czechoslovakia. It's now in Slovakia, where she grew up. And this was just the cursive she and all of her kin learned painfully in school, to the extent that they had time to go to school. And just by pure chance, I went to a strict French school. I'm from Montreal originally, where we learned a very similar florid cursive line. I mean, that's just kind of old school European. But by the time Warhol starts to ask her to do his lettering for him, it looks incredibly characterful and wacky and excessively feminine, and people just loved it. So it has a quality for the looker that it didn't have for the maker in this case. She, of course, didn't see it as anything special. It's just the way she was taught to write. But for a 1950s audience, it seemed old world and cute and sort of gloriously feminine.
She was pulled into his world and moved to New York and just never left. And that is such a strange existence for a young man in his 20s to be living with his mother.
A young gay man bringing lovers home. I mean, it got really complicated.
Yeah, until then he bought a 4-story house and installed her in the basement. But he lived with her until she died in, I think, the early 70s.
Exactly, yeah. But the family to this day doesn't like when you say basement, because it's not completely underground. It's like a semi-basement. I mean, it's a fascinating story. It looks, from everything I've been able to find out, that she was actually unbelievably smart. In fact, someone who knew them both in the 50s said that she was way smarter than Andy, and he probably would have agreed. But she came across as an old world babushka because her English was lousy and she was strange. People attributed her eccentricity to, coming from the old world. But that wasn't it. She was just a really eccentric, interesting, wacky, kind of outsider avant-gardist, I guess you could call her. And Warhol took that and inserted it into his art by having her do the lettering.
Also, there's parts of like him growing up with her making flowers out of like peach cans and selling them during the Depression and all kinds of like homemade soups and all kinds of folk art and stuff. Do you think that some of his art was kind of a reaction to this kind of like anti-folksy things that she would make? But also, this is the kind of stuff it seems like he would collect is by outsider artists. And this is what he was attracted to as well.
His childhood, right up until the 50s, the art world was completely obsessed with outsider art. People don't realize that. Alfred Barr, when he was the director of Museum of Modern Art, showed a shoeshine stand, a gloriously decorated outsider art shoeshine stand, and got demoted for doing that. His board of directors was so angry at him that he got demoted to a curatorial position. He was no longer director. That's how important outsider art was, but how problematic it was. So if you were an avant-gardist coming of age in the 1940s, outsider art was incredibly important to you. And Warhol actually particularly liked commercial artists who worked in an outsider mode. And that's part of the secret of what he's doing, too. There is a kind of outsiderish quality to his work. And of course, once he involves his mother in it, it's, completely outsider-ish. So he was kind of transplanting that element of the avant-garde, of fine art, into the world of commercial art. And that was part of the reason for his success. Of course, it pretty much disappears once he starts making pop art, as does the explicit gay content. I mean, there's a gay subtext in all of his pop art, but it's not like the drawings of men kissing that he was trying to show in New York in the 50s.
One interesting element is that a lot of his motifs in this 1950s kind of proto-fine art period, ranging from flowers to him drawing heroin addicts for book covers, these kind of reverberate throughout and show up later in his fine art period in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah, it's always hard to know if he hadn't made pictures of flowers and done a commissioned commercial drawing of a drug addict. Would he not have done it in the 60s? I think he probably would have treated those subjects because they're so obviously right for what he's doing as a pop artist. I do think it's really important to recognize the fundamental difference between doing a cutesy pie hand-drawn image of a flower in a 50s commercial or even fine art context, which had very little, how can I put it? That's not an avant-garde gesture. It's not that interesting a gesture compared to what he does with the flower paintings in 1964, right, which is a truly radical gesture. It's his first show at Leo Castelli Gallery, the most important show of his life, and he presents something that's almost interchangeable with like a textile pattern. He presents these images, these paintings of flowers, these silk screens of flowers, at every size, as though they were a commercial product available at different sizes, and in every colorway, which of course is a phrase from textiles. Basically, he's presenting canvases that might as well be commercial product, that might as well be textiles, that in fact are very close to the kind of Marimekko flower patterns that are big in that moment in the 60s. So that's a radical conceptual move. It's a relational move. It's not so much about what the flowers look like. It's really about what they mean, how he's undermining normal notions of fine art. If you're drawing a cutesy pie picture of a flower, you're not undermining traditional notions of fine art. You're right in the thick of what the general public thinks fine art should be.
One thing I think that we should talk about real quick is just that the kind of queer element of like the 50s work is the most important thing. Is I think, especially for like young people, have no frame of reference. Being gay in New York was illegal in the 50s, and that he was also coming from it being even more serious in the 40s in Pittsburgh. So this was very rebellious of him on a personal level, but also societally.
It's really hard to remember just how evil the attitude towards homosexuality was in the United States in the 1940s and 50s. I mean, you could be put away almost for life. You were likely to be beaten to death by some tough college kids, or not even tough college kids. Your average college kid on a Saturday night would go out gay bashing for fun in Pittsburgh, certainly. I mean, that was true even in my youth in the 70s in New York and in Montreal. It was really hard to be gay. It was courageous. And to make art that was explicitly gay was so unacceptable as to be hugely exciting. That's why Warhol did it. And then when he comes up with pop art, which he gets away with because it's so much less obviously gay, there's still really strong subtexts of homosexuality, of gay culture, of homosociality. I mean, doing pictures of pretty flowers, doing silk screens of pretty flowers that might as well be textiles, that's a very, in the terms of the time, a very effeminate move, right? No real male artist would do that kind of thing. And he's often got a gay subtext underneath his pop art, even his Campbell Soup paintings. My favorite drawing ever is from the early 60s, and it's of a beautiful naked man's foot, drawn very much in his 50s style, kind of caressing a can of Campbell Soup. Right? So it's a kind of hinge between his 50s gay work and his 60s pop work, except the can is turned so all you see is the word camp. So it's clearly a reference to camp, and all of his pop art is campy and meant to be campy and is a reference to camp. And everyone at the time who thought about camp for a minute knew that it was deeply embedded in gay culture, comes out of gay culture into the larger American world. It's quite clear that the camp element in his pop art flags it as having gay connotations.
He had such a special ability for drawing, and just for him to kind of push that aside for the rest of his career, it seems like that is kind of like a sacrifice that would have been like hard to do, but it doesn't seem like he was much of a doodler or anything, that he kind of really just stepped aside, that he kind of had the eyes on the prize or something. It's kind of hard to fathom making this decision and what the ramifications were on a personal level.
Yeah, although his skills as a draftsman are really complicated because he's actually, when you see him drawing like the floor plan for an exhibition or taking casual notes, they're terrible. I could do as good a job, which tells you just how terrible they are. Most artists who have basic drawing skills can't do a drawing that isn't more or less realistic. If they draw a square, it's quadrilineal or quadrilateral, I guess is the phrase. He actually was a kind of lousy traditional draftsman. What he could do is, how can I put this, do what he needed to do with a pen, right? So if he needed to make a blotted line drawing, he knew how to do that. His excellence from the moment he started making art to the moment he died was getting to the point he needed to be at, doing what he needed to do to get a result that he wanted. The result is really what mattered. And his draftsmanship, I think, was always what it took to get a given result. And once he starts doing pop art, there was no reason to include anything hand-drawn in it because it wasn't part of what he was aiming for. So it's really complicated and interesting, his relationship to the hand. And of course, given that the general public and even the art public, even into the 60s, still believed in the maker's hand, right? That cliche, to this day, it still amazingly dominates what are supposed to be sophisticated corners of the art world. Rejecting that is central to his notion of the avant-garde.
People still think they want Jeff Koons to sculpt a puppy with his own hands.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. The New Yorker, in a recent article on Brancusi, kind of diss Rodin for not carving his own marble sculptures, and that's completely normal in the history of Old Master sculpture. And yet, people still want things made by the artist hand. It's kind of amazing.
At the same time, I kind of can't blame them. That's why I really like the Warhol 50s stuff, and it kind of makes it more special that he actually is touching it himself, and it seems kind of more of a pure expression of him, especially someone who created a persona of such artifice, or, whether you think that is a persona or is it just him evolving or what.
I definitely think it's a persona. What I'd say is that Warhol's always faking it. From the very beginning of his life to the very end, in every domain of his life, I'd say. And I think that has to do with growing up gay in Pittsburgh. There was no way to be yourself, in a way. You weren't allowed to be yourself. You had to present something that the outer world wants. He never gave up on that. So I think even when you look at the 50s drawings, and they seem to be a kind of outpouring of Warhol, I think he's kind of faking what it is to have an outpouring from your soul. So that's why they're based on photographs, but they feel like something much more personal. I think it's all about that kind of sophisticated fakery. There's always a kind of meta quality to his work, even in the 50s. I think he was born a postmodernist. I think maybe being gay in the 40s kind of forced you into a level of postmodern irony from the very beginning. And that just carries through his whole career. I'm curating a show in Stockholm right now about him as a conceptualist, about his concept of business art. And yet we're opening it with the 50s work for good reasons, I think, because we should talk about this. The business side of that work is really important. But I know that visitors to the show are going to just love that work. It's the easy work. And I don't want people to flee the difficult later work into the early 50s work.
I also think it's interesting that he kind of never gave up on commercial work. Like he was still always hustling and doing like a Time magazine cover and doing ads and this kind of stuff. And I think a lot of that stems from him growing up in poverty, having to never stop hustling and make a buck and always be a shark.
Yeah, people don't realize we've been talking through this whole podcast about his 50s drawings, his 50s commercial illustration. That style, mostly done by an assistant who knew how to fake Warhol style, continues right through 66. He's already stopped making pop silkscreens. He's now a completely avant-garde underground filmmaker, and yet this factory is being supported by his work as a commercial illustrator in a 50s style.
Oh, see, I thought it had completely shut down by then.
He wanted you to think that, but he didn't want anyone to know that in a room in his house, his assistant Nathan Gluck is still turning out piles of 1950s style illustrations, which are still selling fine to art directors.
Am I correct in thinking that the commercial work was shutting down a bit also just because of technology? And like it kind of made me think of now about how the internet shuts down this or Web3 and this or that. And back then it was photography was coming on the scene. And that's what made illustration less in demand.
Absolutely. I mean, he saw the writing on the wall. You know, to this day, I know people who are commercial illustrators. It still exists. It didn't die completely. But for a man who always wanted to be on the forefront of everything, it was clear that there was not going to be much of a future, or not the same kind of future in commercial illustration as there had been in the 50s.
So throughout this period, Warhol always made his own work. He always made personal work. He always made fine art. But when did it finally start kind of resonating and start hitting? It seemed like there was like a real specific moment that the zeitgeist finally caught up with him or vice versa.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's probably vice versa in the sense that he really starts being recognized in the world of serious, as it were, fine art, avant-garde fine art, whatever you want to call it. In early 1962, he shows for the first time in a group show. It's the pop art, which is one of his great contributions to the history of art. And that's what really launches his career. People realize that presenting a silk-screened painting of $200 bills and possibly even offering that for $200 was a radical move. Or a little bit later, he has his first solo show in Los Angeles in July of 1962, and it's just 32 paintings of Campbell's soup cans. People realized there was something amazing going on when he did that. The origins of it are pretty interesting, though, because that's not the first time he shows his pop art. The first time he shows his pop art is in a window at the Gunther Jekyll department store, the street side window, in April of 1961. So it's a bunch of mannequins. It's a normal store window. It's a bunch of mannequins showing girls' dresses, colorful girls' dresses. And behind it is a series of paintings on easels, mostly, of images from advertising and from comic books, including an image of Superman from a Lois Lane comic book. So it's very specifically girly imagery. And they're sitting behind these paintings. This is Warhol's first pop art. It's still hand-painted pop art. And it's really born as props. And I think what happens is he makes the props for this window. They are, how can I put it, a new kind of art that he's imagining as a prop at first. It's the weirdest damn thing. And then he realizes in a kind of Duchampian moment, no, wait a minute. I can take these wacky, fascinating props I made that kind of predict a new kind of art and use them as a new kind of art. It's one of the most amazing moments in the history of Western art, really.
I think also that there's also like personal elements to these paintings, because one of us a before and after. It shows a before and after nose job, and he was obsessed with his nose and had already gotten his first nose job at that point. And comics, grew up reading them and stuff.
One is a comic image of Superman blowing, right? Which is kind of interesting for a gay man. And it's not from a normal Superman comic. It's from a Lois Lane comic. And it's a comic about Lois Lane looking for the ideal husband. So it's completely suffused with gay content. And that whole window is, and of course, it's meant to appeal to young girls because Gunther Jekyll, which had been this matronly furrier, at that very moment, it had just been bought by Bonwit Teller, and it's trying to appeal to teenage girls who all of a sudden had money in their pockets. And there's lots of articles about that in the trade press, that these teenage girls have money to spend, and Gunther Jekyll wants to get that money out of their pockets, so they hire Warhol to help them appeal to teenage girls. Because Warhol, throughout all the 50s, has this particular talent at a kind of feminized commercial art. But what he does is he creates a new kind of high art that has those same qualities.
I think people have a great interest in the very beginnings of his pop era also. We've been talking a lot about the 50s, which I think is good to talk about because everyone kind of ignores the 50s. But this very beginning of the 60s, I think people have been very interested in since the 80s. I think there was like a Dia show of this hand-painted Warhol pop era, and Gagosian had a show of this, and maybe it's going to factor into your show that you're curating. People are very drawn to this. I think they see it as this kind of archaeological view of like what would become pop and what would become his work, really.
Yeah, although it's amazing, it comes kind of full-fledged almost at once. Even that window at Gunther Jekyll is pretty full-fledged pop art. It's not silkscreened yet, but it has all the other qualities of pop art. And the silkscreening happens pretty soon after he starts showing pop art of any kind. Of course, it's all appropriational. I mean, the central act of Warhol's art in the 1960s and beyond is appropriational. Having said which, I think we haven't talked about something really important, which is Warhol's elision of the distinction between commerce and fine art. His acknowledgement that all fine art is also commercial product. The first work he ever shows in a commercial gallery in the 60s is that painting, that silkscreen, I should say, of $200 bills. Is there anything that's showing that a work of art is also a commodity? It's that first work of pop art by Andy Warhol. And that elision between those two categories, that practice that he later calls business art, that's really central. And I think his 50s experience as a businessman, right, as an artist who's mostly a businessman producing product, shapes his interest in business as a kind of art supply. And that's there already in his very early pop art, and I think becomes the dominant force in the late 60s when it's a full-blown conceptual practice, not just for Warhol, but for a whole bunch of people. And then in the 70s and 80s, when he does ads, when he does an Absolute vodka ad, actually paints a painting to appear in an Absolute vodka ad, that's business art. And that's a really sophisticated conceptual practice, pretending to be just old-fashioned selling out. Or at least that's the argument of the show I'm curating in October in Stockholm. It's about Warhol as a business artist and all the other very serious conceptualists who are doing exactly the same work, and no one remembers that. They think Warhol is this kind of sellout and is faking it when he declares this practice as a business artist, but he was not at all alone. Really important artists, Robert Morris, Chris Burden, all of these important conceptualists were, at least for a couple of years, working on exactly the same terrain.
After years of wandering in the forest of silk screening and of making films and silver floating balloon clouds, when he teamed up with Basquiat, he kind of reconnected, I think, and was like re-inspired and reinvigorated and kind of returned this handmade touch to some of these works.
Yeah, although my take on that is a little unusual. I think that it reminds me of what happens in the 50s, where he uses a relatively antiquated, even conservative touch, a traditional, pretty line to render gay content. And what matters is that the line is kind of, if you like, transparent. Because it's traditional, it doesn't matter. And you can look through it to the penises that it's showing, right, in the 50s. I see something similar happening with the Basquiat collaborations, because what matters there is collaboration as a conceptual strategy and race. He's working with a young black former street artist, right? So that's what really matters there. And by returning to the handmade, he's allowing that to shine through, right? Because in a sense, silkscreen belongs to pop art. It has its own baggage. It has its own valence. By going back to the hand, he can sort of say, Don't pay attention to the how. Don't pay attention to style. That's not what matters here. What matters is content and the social dynamic and collaboration. And that's what really matters here. So I can afford to go back to a traditional technique in order to let those other components shine through.
Those paintings are kind of the pinnacle of his work being reevaluated, of stuff being just so hated at the time to now. They're just like these like blockbuster auction results for them and stuff.
Well, this is my problem. This relates a little bit to what I was saying about how people want to flee to the 50s work and they love it and they're paying more for it and everything. I hate to say it, but that's what I think is happening with some of those Basquiat Warhol collaborations. In a way, conceptually, they're easier than his most difficult, the piss paintings, or especially in the business art, which I feel is really conceptually complex. You know, some hand-painted collaborations with a hot young artist, that's something the market can get its teeth into. I'm not so interested in what the market gets its teeth into. I want my brain to get its teeth into the work, not the market.
Speaking of the piss paintings, which are very beautiful, the Oxidation series, that's something else, he did by hand, if you use
body part anyways.
If you use a broader umbrella term, but it's interesting that these were created by urinating on oxidized canvas and creating kind of like an abstract color field. But sometimes he just employed visitors to the factory to pee on them, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I mean, he tried that at first, but the story goes that they were lousy peers. And the women, when they peed, left too big a pool on the canvas. So he ended up, just him and his assistant, Ronnie Coutron, ended up being the principal peers for those works. As a connoisseur, I can always tell his pee from anyone else's pee in those paintings.
Of course. I never hear anyone talking about those these days, or like seeing those. They're so cool.
Yeah, they're not stable as part of the problem. They change over time. They're still oxidizing. And I think that somewhat freaks out certain collectors, maybe even museums. I don't know about that. But they are interesting in that way. They do change. Apparently in the early, for the first few years at any rate, they smelled too, which was a problem.
I guess they're just going to turn solid green.
Yeah, eventually they might, eventually. Yeah. He wouldn't mind that. He would be happy to see that happen. Makes them more interesting.
I wasn't aware that he knew Yves Klein.
One of the most important discoveries I think I made in the book, we don't know how much they knew about each other, but Yves Klein was doing the rounds of the most interesting studios in 1962, being led to them by Larry Rivers, who was a friend of Warhol's at that point, a pretty good, important friend. It's hard to imagine that Yves Klein did not see Warhol's studio, but even if he didn't, Yves Klein did a show at Castelli that Warhol had to have seen. Warhol bought some Kleins pretty soon. And then Yves Klein starts talking about pop art kind of subjects, about kitsch, just after this moment. So I think that there's a really strong connection there. And Warhol starts doing his monochromes that he called blanks. He would present one silk-screened image, of a car crash or something, and pair that as a diptych with an absolute monochrome. And that's clearly a reference to Yves Klein. And one of his very first silk-screen portraits is a silk-screen portrait of one of Warhol's greatest heroes, Robert Rauschenberg, done, guess what, in a color that's almost exactly the same as International Klein Blue, Yves Klein's famous color. So I think that the connection's really important and really strong. And someone should do a whole show just on Yves Klein and his influence on American art, because I think it's much bigger than people realize.
I completely forget about him having this reputation as like a prankster. Everyone just thinks this is this chic blue guy, and when before it was a completely different vibe.
I mean, I think he's absolutely a conceptual artist. I think most of his talk about the spiritual, the transcendent, I think that's almost all BS, and he didn't believe it. It was just part of his persona. One of his most important effects on Warhol, I think, was in making clear how important persona was. One of your artistic creations was yourself. And Klein is the great example of that at that moment. And Warhol isn't really doing it all that much at the beginning of the 60s, but he soon realizes that the leather jacket and sunglasses, which he adopts quite late, 64, 65, that is as important an element in his art making as any silkscreen he ever did.
Do you think that there's like a quintessential handmade Warhol work or series?
There are these gorgeous, huge handmade Campbell soup cans that people don't tend to know about. They're often crushed. The Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh has some, and they're just gorgeous things. They're much bigger than what you think of. In a way, they're a mistake. What really matters is when he does the absolutely four square 32 Campbell soup cans, almost indistinguishable except for the change in flavor. And they're based not even on a photograph, as the large Campbell soup cans are. They're based on a commercial logo, as it were, from Campbell Soup stationery. So they are as appropriational as possible. That's what really matters. But the images of Campbell soup cans they made just before are awfully gorgeous and irresistible, and depend on them being handmade. Really good handmade art should need to be handmade. And these things do all sorts of clever work with the materials to look like giant enlargements of Campbell soup cans.
I want to know about just writing the book itself. You know, there's many Warhol biographies out there, and this stands apart from all of them with so much detail, so many new characters, so many new stories and twists and turns in it that you really actually get receipts. There's so much information in here. I don't know where you get it. I assume that you really had just complete access to the archives. Tell me about this journey of making it.
It was crazy. I had access to Warhol's archive, and I had no idea when I started this book how much there was in there. I mean, it's every taxi receipt, every ticket stub from movies and theater. So thanks to the internet, if you know the date and the name of the theater, you can find out what was playing. So I was able to find out what Warhol was seeing, which was really exciting. But you know, the best thing about writing the book, and it was an unbelievable pleasure and unbelievable challenge, was that I came away with new ideas about Warhol. It was incredibly fertile practice for me to do this. What I found, and what I hope comes through in the book, is that all of this detail, all the information about Warhol actually teaches you new ways of thinking about Warhol. It's not random information. I have random information. I think I've got 70,000 items in my Warhol database, and not all of those are in the book, I'm very glad to say. I tried to only use information that somehow or other got at something that mattered about him as an artist. Now, luckily, as a biographer, everything that matters about Warhol as a person matters to him as an artist. So I was kind of lucky that way. But I really hope that there isn't random information. For me, at least, when I reread my book, which I try not to do too often, the information seems fertile to me. And I come across with new ideas about Warhol even to this day. So my understanding of Warhol, I'd written tons of reviews of Warhol shows before I wrote this book. You know, I was an art critic for decades before I wrote this book. I thought I knew a lot about Warhol. But studying him in that kind of detail, studying his life, really opened up whole new avenues of thinking for me about him as an artist and his art.
Where were the archives?
You know, the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh got all of his papers after he died. And people have probably heard about the 612 time capsules, which he declared a work of art. He would basically, this is a slight caricature, but basically take everything that was on his desk at the end of the day, all the junk mail, et cetera, and all his receipts, and throw them into a box and declare that something called a time capsule and say this was a sculpture. So there's 612 of these boxes that got inventoried just before I started my book. And that's one reason I could write the book, is because these boxes have been inventoried. What people don't realize is that that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a huge room in the archives that's just every random weird boxes and bags, and you just can't imagine all the stuff that's in there. And even the archivists are only now finding out what's in there. So I would open a box with Matt Werbekin, the great archivist, and we would just find weird, fascinating, important stuff in these boxes, and a lot of it ended up in the book.
What happened to his art collection? I didn't know that he was such a collector, and such an early collector too, and that he, besides buying Yves Klein, that he did the Stella commission, bought like 12 Stella paintings, and he had the money to do this as a commercial artist, but also there was no art market at the time, so for like nothing.
He commissioned a series of miniature versions of important early Stellas. He bought Jasper Johns when Jasper Johns was just hitting it big. He was an amazing collector. He bought Yves Klein. Later, he bought work you wouldn't expect him to buy. He bought the relics of Chris Burden performances. He bought one of the very first Richard Serra prop pieces, you know, those super threatening accumulations of stuff that can just about kill people if they fall over. When you look at the receipts, as I did, you see all this. Some of them have gone missing. There's no trace of that really important early Richard Serra, but the receipt is there, so we know he owned it at one point. There's all sorts of things like that that he was buying. He was a really important, interesting collector, and most importantly, he was only collecting the most avant-garde art, and that's what he wanted to be. He wanted to be part of that world. He wanted his art to be collectible in the same way that an early Sarah Prop was collectible.
What was his attitude to his life prior? Once he kind of was like, okay, he kept up the commercial practice for a while, but then finally did end it. It seems like he was a bit dismissive of it and was like, okay, I did shoes for a minute, but I mean, he had like a really full life, but it seems like he kind of tried to escape it a bit.
Oh, absolutely. He wasn't just dismissive of his 50s work. He did everything in his power to hide it, including destroying just vast quantities of the handmade work. We have stories about him taking out black trash bags full of these early drawings and not putting them in his own trash because he thought people would go through it and say, look, I got an Andy Warhol. He'd put it in the neighbor's trash so that it would disappear incognito into the incinerators. He really didn't want people to know about the work, even though it should have fit with his concept of business art, right? The problem, I think, with it was that it was too straight. It couldn't be ironized. It just looked like the normal work of a normal commercial artist. Once he's a pop artist making lousy ads for things, then it gets complicated. Then you ask yourself, wait, is this interesting conceptual pop art or is this just selling out? That's interesting. In a sense, the 50s drawings were just old-fashioned selling out, or not selling out, but selling. But it's much harder to ironize that business practice from the 50s, and that's why he needed to get rid of all the traces of it.
Well, that is enough Warhol to process for today, and it's been very enlightening, and your book has really changed the way I think about Warhol's career, and so has our conversation today. Thank you so much for stopping by and talking to me.
It's such a pleasure. Weirdly, I have been stuck in Warhol for so many years now, and I still get a total thrill talking about it. So thanks for letting me talk about Warhol once again.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.